Our products work together to support continuous learning inside and outside the classroom. Accurately assess with STAR assessments. Reach new literacy goals with Accelerated Reader. Provide 24/7 access to authentic texts with MyOn. Differentiate instruction with Freckle. Uncover learning loss and equity issues with Schoolzilla. Celebrate with a complete picture of student performance. We support the learner, wherever they're learning, in a whole new way.
So today, our final presentation is coming from Emma, and she's going to teach us about what she learned. Can we get a round of applause for Emma?
Hello everyone. My presentation today is how our school uniforms are made.
You can't put words to how important kids are.
Dennis Uniform was founded in 1920.
You want their lives to be full of love. You want them to be smart and successful and confident. It's my job as a teacher to make it all happen, and I do it every day as best I possibly can. But still, you try to think of every little detail. They're worth it. After a while, you forget that you're their teacher. You become like a parent, and they become your family.
While the world was shutting down, we were busy keeping schools like yours running. Now more than ever, schools are finding themselves with the urgent need of transformative technology. This is where we come in. At Education Technology Professionals, we let your teachers do what they do best without having to worry whether the technology they rely on is working properly. By working exclusively with schools, we have a unique understanding of IT needs in education. However, we provide more than just basic IT support. We are your Director of Technology, your Technology Integration Coach, your Network Administrator, Cybersecurity Expert, and Technology Teacher, all in one. We handle your big picture needs such as technology planning, budgeting, purchasing, and vendor management, all while keeping a firm handle on routine day-to-day IT issues that may arise. Visit our website at educationtechpros.com to learn more about our services.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this NCEA 2021 live session entitled Recommitting to Retreats, Ideals and Best Practices to Pursue Post-Pandemic. Our presenter is Dan Masterton. We invite you to engage with this presentation using the messaging and questions function in the event platform. At the conclusion of the session, you will have the opportunity to complete a post-session evaluation and provide feedback that will also track your participation in our sessions. If you run into any problems, we invite you to refresh your page or use the help section on the event platform. Dan, thank you for being with us here at NCEA 2021, and we turn it over to you.
Thank you, guys. It's great to be with you, everybody. Just going to share my screen for my PowerPoint. And I thought we'd just jump right into it. My name is Dan Masterton. I want to talk to you today about recommitting to your retreats. One of my first jobs as a campus minister, I worked at a middle-sized diocesan high school, and that school had never had the Kairos retreat program before. So just as I was getting hired, my chaplain had set things up to start our Kairos program from scratch. And one of the things that was really great about that is it gave us a chance to be really particular about the retreat schedule, really particular about the mechanics, and to try to build a retreat culture that we thought was healthy and holistic. It also gave us a chance to be a little bit more nimble about the adjustments we wanted to make, how we wanted to change the sequence and schedule of the retreat, and how we wanted to redistribute things like student break period, and to really optimize the leadership application process. It was also kind of liberating to not have the full weight of a decades-long tradition weighing over us as we tried to optimize those genetic essentials that make a retreat like Kairos as great as it is. So we could make some tweaks and variations to try to meet our students where they are and to address our students' context as best we could. A lot of times in ministry, especially in high school campus ministry, we're relying on what's been done in years past, or we're making time crunched changes on the fly. Sometimes we might long to have a moment where there's a little less urgency, a little less pressure, but still a lot of opportunity. And today, I think this COVID era with these pandemic restrictions could be that time. So COVID has constrained what we can do socially. Our behaviors have been pared down to much less than what they usually were. And that meant that our retreats had to take a really different shape. So I want to use today's time not to dwell on that adaptation and not to dwell on how exactly things will return to normal or when, but instead to acknowledge that this time could be a really great potential opportunity for all of us to recommit to our retreats and reimagine them to be closer and more fully reflect the ideals that we know retreats should have. So I always like to say that retreats are one of the three key pillars of good campus ministry. Along with service and justice, along with prayer and liturgy, retreats are one of those three main areas that campus ministers really focus on programmatically. So today and in this moment, I'm wondering, can we take a dynamic view of retreat programs and self-audit our programming a little bit? So today I want to reestablish the definitional characteristics of retreat a little bit. I want to run through some broad programmatic values that you could consider. And I want to focus on three really big integral elements as the last piece. And the overarching thing I want you to think about is, can we take this opportunity during the COVID pandemic and during these restricted ministry times? Can we take this opportunity to adapt what we did? Sorry, to look at how we adapted what we did, to look at the things we did to get by and get through this era, and then think about what we ideally want to strive for in the times going forward. So how can we use this moment as a jump start? First, I want to do a little bit of a rundown of some of the defining characteristics of a retreat, because at times you'll see certain things called retreats that I think don't quite deserve that label. Things like days of reflection, evenings of reflection, talks with a discussion afterwards are all valuable, but I think a retreat is something a little bit more than that. And I want to kind of review some of those key definitional elements. So first, a retreat is a gathering that has its own time, space, and context. Time-wise, a school retreat really should be at least a school day's worth of programming. Not just a few hours, but at least a full day, if not an overnight or multi-night experience. Preferably that time should be broken up and used in a way that's significantly different and a significant departure from the normal class day or day's schedule. There should be a feel to the use of the time that's different than a normal student day. Retreats need their own space. Retreats should happen in an area that's dedicated and set apart. In an ideal situation, you can get to a retreat center that has breakout rooms for small groups to have discussions, chapels with adaptable arrangements for prayer services or masses, large group rooms that can be reconfigured to listen to a talk in a large group or to move tables and chairs for more kinetic activities. But there also is like a realistic side of it too. Sometimes we need to hold our retreats on site. Sometimes we are only able to get to a local parish or a faith-based organization's multi-purpose room. And so we have to be realistic. But the idea is that space is used as best as it can be to make it feel different from classes, lunchrooms, and other things that are kind of more mundane to student life. Finally, context. A retreat needs to be a place of welcome, love, and accompaniment. It needs to be a place where confidentiality and trust are established by the directors and leaders and also in small group discussions. And it needs to be a place where faith sharing and reflection are the focus rather than things like academic learning or pure social time. Secondly, a retreat should have a spiritual purpose. Seems kind of funny to say that, but sometimes retreat is used for things like political gatherings when congressmen step away from Washington to talk about other topics. A retreat in the sense of our schools should really be spiritual. And ideally, that spiritual purpose has an individual component and a communal component. So students should be given their own time and space to journal, to have moments of prayer, both within Mass and prayer service and on their own. And they should also have some choice of how to spend their breaks or the time leading up to bedtime or the time following bedtime or following wake up time in the morning. There needs to be room for them to have their own individual engagements. But then communally as well, small group discussions, large group talks and activities, communal prayer and faith sharing should all give people a chance to come together and celebrate their faith prayerfully and communally. Next, retreats should be catechetically informed, even if they're not primarily catechetical. So for instance, when a student walks away from an intensive retreat, their takeaways might be something a little bit more generic or less sharply articulated, like my eyes are more open to the power of relationships around me. And that's all well and good. But beneath that, Retreat directors, adults who are helping with retreat administration and chaperoning, student leaders who are formed and trained to take charge of the retreats, they should have something a little bit deeper and broader behind what they're doing and why they're doing it. So for instance, Kairos is a popular retreat in our high schools. Underneath all of the activities that become so popular and beloved are the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, are scripture passages carefully chosen by directors and chaplains and mass celebrants to connect with those themes and challenge people to go deeper into their spirituality. So for instance, students may walk away from the fourth day of Kairos thinking about going out into the world and bringing their love to one another. Underneath that, there might be stories like the Transfiguration, where people come close to Christ and Christ tells them to take what they've seen and bring it back down from the mountain with them. Or something like the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, where Jesus meets his friends and tells them, go forth and make of all disciples and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I wouldn't necessarily expect students to have those exact quotes in their heads as they're telling people about their retreat, but I do hope that directors and retreat leaders are coming from a point of view that's a little more richly catechetical like that. Fourth, the retreat needs to have an emphasis on faith sharing. In a high school student's life or in a middle school student's life, there's plenty of times where they're talking to friends in kind of a lunchroom chatter sort of dynamic. There's plenty of times where they're having conversations, just bantering up and down the hallways. There's plenty of times in their classrooms where their teachers and peers are having discussions about academic subjects. When we talk about retreat faith sharing, these are questions that get at personal reflection, emotion, vulnerability. There needs to be a leap that brings these discussions and conversations to another place that involves identifying God's presence, talking about your struggles to identify God's presence, and things that kind of follow in that vein. We'll focus on faith sharing more a little bit later. The last part is that in a Catholic school, there needs to be a broader campus ministry framework. Retreats are really important milestone experiences, but if they don't funnel students back into a community life of faith back at their schools, they tend to be flashes in the pan that fade away. So retreats should be part of a broader 4-year at a high school or multi-year trajectory across a student's faith experience at that school. They should be integrated with the prayer and liturgy and the service and justice ministries of the school as well. And then kind of zooming out to the whole school, ideally your theology classes, your school-wide ministry and formation mindset, and the way that families and faith communities partner with schools to help raise these young people in their faith are all coming together with retreats as a piece of that puzzle. So that's what I would argue constitutes a great retreat. If we're to dig into this a little bit further, I want to try to help you look at some areas that you could consider for a self-audit of your retreat programs. So coming up for the rest of this presentation, we're going to kind of hop through stepping stones of a few broader ideals that you could consider for your retreat programs. And then beyond that, to use the last chunk of time to really focus on 3 major areas of retreat ministry that if you were to say, I don't have all the time in the world, but I really want to focus on the meat and potatoes of retreat, it would be those 3 areas that we'll spend the last few minutes on. So if you're inclined to grab your smartphone and scan the QR code, it'll bring you to a website where I've put up a retreat audit resource packet. And what it does is it takes you through each of these areas we'll talk about today, gives you some bullet points about why each area is important, a couple examples of how you could implement that value or idea a little bit better, and then a few questions at the bottom that you could use to literally self-audit yourselves as you look at your retreat program and your campus ministry and consider how it could grow, develop, and deepen. So that QR code will be on all the slides if you decide you want to grab it later, but I'm going to keep going now into this first set of broader ideals to consider. So the first one I want to talk about is hospitality. Hospitality refers to the intentional considerations of welcome, teaching, engagement, and the ways that you address all students, not just your really strong and devout practicing Catholic students, but your casual Catholics, maybe lapsed Catholics whose families don't practice, non-Catholic Christians, and even students of other faiths or no faith tradition at all. One way you could consider doing that, when you choose your presider or celebrant for a mass or prayer service, try to encourage them or even give them concrete suggestions on how to be specifically explaining parts of Catholic practice to not just the non-Catholics or non-religious in the group, but to the Catholics as well to help them learn better. It could be something as small as having the priest narrate through the preparation of the altar, identifying how the students bringing forward the bread and wine are bringing forward gifts from the community to the altar as a sacrifice of the people of God to the church and to this worship. It could be something as simple as saying that when we mix the water and wine, it comes from a symbolic practice that represents the divinity and humanity of Jesus Christ together in one person, but was also a practical consideration because the wine in the early church was sort of thick and gelatinous and needed to be watered down and mixed. So you can do things like that to help deepen the understanding of what we're actually celebrating together in our retreats. Secondly, there does need to be prayer, liturgy, and sacraments consistently throughout a retreat program. As you look at the shape and content of different retreats, you'll find different moments where it might make sense to include a mass. It might make sense to design a non-Eucharistic prayer service. There might be a period where it fits to use an Eucharistic adoration. You can kind of pick and choose depending on how your retreats are shaped. One way I like to do this is to not just do mass, but to consider a morning and evening prayer format that you can create the structure for and then reuse with different content as you go through the retreat. So you might have the same structure, but the scripture passage and then the person giving a homily style reflection may change for each service. That sort of predictability and pattern can be a really good way for students to get used to the way that you're praying together and plug into it a little bit better and better each time you do it. Third, differentiation. This is a word I never would have used until I had to part-time campus minister and part-time teach, and I had some really good academic coaching about the importance of differentiation. So on the one hand, retreats should vary between individual, small group, and large group content. But then there also should be differentiation in terms of the style of activities you use. So of course, retreats will involve some passive reception where students are listening to a speaker or a mass celebrant just talk and they're just sitting and listening. But there should also be some time where students are writing, journaling. There should be some time where students are discussing in small groups or maybe in a large group share out. There should be activities that are kinetic where students are asked to get up and move from place to place, maybe organizing under signs that represent responses to a question, or moving around to put post-it notes or answers on large post-it note paper on the walls. You should consider tactile things. So are there ways that you can have students use their hands and be touching and shaping things? There's some interesting things you can do with clay, with gardening, to get people using their hands. And then finally, don't be afraid of creative and artistic activities. It could be as simple as reminding students that during journaling periods, things like poetry and artistic free writing are welcome and encouraged. It could be something like collage making out of recycled magazines, or doing drawings that respond to a question like, what is your image of God? Another ideal to incorporate, safe environment. Kind of first and foremost, this is how we honor the trust that families place in us to take care of their students on a daily basis, but especially when we take them out onto a retreat. But even beyond that, we have to dig down, looking at our diocesan rules and the policies that our schools, religious communities, and other sources have in place, to thinking about the actual retreat schedule and how it ensures the student safety as well. So are you getting students enough time to sleep? Do they have a reasonable bedtime and a reasonable waking time? I recommend that there be at least 8 hours between lights out and wake ups. And then are you giving students breaks beyond 5 minutes to use the bathroom between activities, such that there's a period of time that's unstructured with no demands on them, where they can choose their way to decompress and to socialize with each other, or to step away and take a break for themselves. So safe environment, very important. Kind of moving into the larger picture and the follow-up, what are the takeaways that students are getting from your retreat program? There needs to be some intentionality about how do you sustain the impact of a retreat beyond just being a milestone experience where you're catching lightning in a bottle and then it's dissipating. So with Kairos programs, you'll sometimes see efforts for fourth day programs where students are encouraged to come together around kind of a lighter Kairos style activity that's maybe just an hour or two in length instead of several days. But it gives them a chance to kind of tap back into those feelings and to be able to use the things they've practiced on Kairos to have fresh discussions or to socialize together in a faith-based environment around a mass or prayer service. But there also maybe is even a more important need to specifically pay attention to the gifts and talents you witness from students while they're on retreat and while you're seeing perhaps a new and better version of themselves that maybe they don't even know they have. And to make sure that you're connecting those things you see to the campus ministry that's waiting for them when they get back to campus. So one of the things I like to do is to keep a fresh roster sheet of everyone on retreat in the front of my directing binder. And as students go forward to share during a large group share out, or whether they come to talk to me during a break, or my leaders are passing along stories of students doing especially well. I like to make little notes, because when the next retreat comes up and you're looking for leaders, when the next all school liturgy comes up and you could use some new gift bearers or hospitality ministers, you have a list of students, you have little notes remembering what it was that they did that really made them shine. And you have an opportunity to connect them to an ongoing ministry that keeps them active beyond the retreat itself. Another big picture thing that's important: can you respond to the negatives that you're seeing in your retreat culture? And hopefully this isn't an issue for you, but I know that as retreats grow and there's year-on-year expectations and culture around what happens on them and the memories and the impact the retreats have, sometimes things can get away from you a little bit, because students may mischaracterize or misdescribe something, or they may become attached to something and skew it away from what it might have originally intended to be. So one example I've seen of this is on a lot of overnight or lengthier retreats, there'll be some sort of picture slideshow or video put together to celebrate all of the fun that happened, the memories that people are making. But I've seen situations where it becomes kind of a vanity exercise, and student leaders can become obsessive about taking pictures, sending them in, maybe even glorifying themselves. Maybe they're staying up way late past lights out or curfew and working on it to an excess. Things like that happen. It's best to try to find ways to adjust or tweak it. But you also may decide that you just have to take an activity away for a period of time, or just lose it altogether. It can be hard, but if there's something that's becoming toxic or negative and doesn't do what it's meant to do, it might be best to just remove it, at least temporarily. The last part of this section is growth points. So it's great to have a retreat program in place that you feel good about and that is sturdy and stable and is doing what you want for your students. So you might be able to ask yourself, what directions can we go in next? Is there a group that we haven't been able to serve as well as we like? Is there a theme we want to address that isn't addressed in other retreats? And one way I would suggest pursuing that is through a retreat creation, planning, and directing process that's student driven that I've come up with. I call it the Camino process. And it's kind of a light scaffolding so that you can set up and shepherd students through the creation and direction of a retreat. So if you want to learn more about that, I'd be happy to talk with you directly. It's also a section in my new book from NCEA called Exploring Faith that's available now through the NCEA store. So now kind of getting into the meat of what I want to talk about today. Those 7 areas are definitely important ideals that you want to be watching closely and trying to ensure and guarantee as best you can for your students. But when we get into what the retreats are actually doing in terms of like nuts and bolts and the actual pieces of how you're preparing and directing the retreats, these last 3 areas are what I would say are the most important. And they're the 3 areas in the thick blue boxes at the end of my retreat audit resource packet. So firstly, witness talks. Once you've established a retreat and you know the topic and thematic focus that you want, witness talks are crucial, because this is the place where you can add the depth and detail and color, because what you're putting there comes from the experience of your leaders. So then it's up to you as a directorial team to take the content and theme of your retreat, identify what the big things you want to focus on in each movement or session are, and then put those into outlines that you can provide to adult or student leaders. If you're working with adults, especially experienced adults, it might be as simple as just a small page with a few little bullet points that really lightly structures out what you want them to do. For students, you're probably going to need something more detailed and in depth. And at times you might even need to have pieces of it that are almost to the point of like a Mad Lib, where it's almost like fill in the blank to really get them to move to speaking to the content that you need them to cover in a talk. When you have that foundation, when you're looking at a more intensive, in-depth retreat, you really need to have a strong scaffolded support so that you're walking with students as they prepare and then deliver talks. So it helps to start simpler. And a good way to do that is through a storytelling exercise. Ask all your student leaders to write a 1 to 2 page story, bring it to your next meeting, and then have them deliver it on the spot to their fellow leaders. You could give them a prompt as simple as write a story about a time of struggle or joy in your life. It helps to leave it simple and give them open-endedness. And that first sharing gives them a chance to see what it's like, not only to put yourself out there, but to hear your peers do it in turn. And it starts to move leaders towards thinking about what it will be like to actually deliver a witness talk. From there, you can move into discernment. I usually do it really simple. I make cards with all of the talk topics and little descriptions, make a second set of cards with all the leaders' names, and then I put them all on the table and ask the students sit together and without calling dibs or being selfish or worrying about your own needs, affirm one another and try to match leaders to topics in a way that gives our retreat the greatest chance to succeed, because you're putting leaders in a position where they're going to best serve the participants. Usually I'll step out of the room for 5 or 10 minutes and let them work on that process. I'll kind of doodle out some pairings myself. And then when I come back, what usually happens is a short exchange where we use what they've come up with as a starting point. They'll usually invite some input from me, and we'll almost always land on something that's pretty universally welcome by all the leaders. Occasionally it may leave someone feeling a little short-shrifted, but it's a good dynamic to start early and often with your leaders, to be collegial and thinking about others rather than worrying about how you're going to best serve yourself and maybe your ambitions as a leader. It keeps people grounded in the right stuff. As far as writing the talk, it helps to have a really robust process with really clear deadlines and pieces of support in place. When I'm working with students, I require that they write out the full text of their talk. I think it's pretty rare that you find a high schooler or even a younger student who's capable of riffing or talking off bullet points. And I think it's healthiest to just ask that they come with a full text that they'll mostly read as they work up at the lectern. One thing I've done with students who are maybe a little bit more of academic strugglers or aren't as comfortable with writing is I'll turn some of the bullet points from an outline for a talk into interview questions, and I'll sit with them for 10 or 15 minutes and I'll transcribe some of their answers. At the end of the interview, I'll turn the doc back to them. It'll usually be a shared doc that they have access to, and tell them, you've already started writing a talk by the way you answered my questions today. You may not have realized it, but a lot of the things you already have in your heart are there to contribute to the talk. And that can be a good way to get wheels turning and get people started. Another helpful thing, if there are adults in your building who are really supportive of the retreat and really enjoy the students' talks, empower them as talk mentors. Partner them with the student leader, ask them to meet 2 or 3 times, working off a shared document and the outline you've provided, and encourage them to talk regularly and be kind of a supplemental voice to your campus ministry to help them craft a great talk. The last part that I'm really big on is a talks rehearsal. When you're doing an intensive retreat, the student leaders really need to practice their talk at full length before the rest of the student leadership team. Kind of like the storytelling exercise, but this time in a classroom at a lectern with everyone spread out so that you get used to addressing a large group. And it's also an opportunity for oral and written feedback from the leadership team to tell that student how they're doing. Students tend to be effusively positive and praiseworthy, and when they do pop in some constructive feedback, they usually take it really well from each other. Selfishly, as a director, it also gives me a chance to see the quality of their talk and to time it and to give them another nudge toward getting those last pieces in place before the retreat goes live, so to speak. One last note about writing talks: work with your adults. Sometimes retreats lean on adults a little too heavily. I find you need to identify a few talks that really need an adult's maturity and perspective. But other than that, try to maximize how much you're using your students to do witness talks. When an adult is asked to give a talk, try to offer as much help as you can, but know who your veterans are and don't overwhelm them with micromanaging or nitpicking. I do just encourage you, if you have someone who's given a talk many times, encourage a growth mindset. It's tempting to recycle the same talk month on month, year on year. And sometimes, an adult's too busy to write a talk from scratch. But do encourage them. Are there ways you can tweak it? Are there ways you can review it and find ways to refine or improve various parts? But you obviously don't need to micromanage a professional in their work. The last thing I'll say about talks is that they're so crucial because a speaker in essence becomes the first sharer in a discussion. They go before the whole group on the retreat, put themselves out there referring to a particular topic or question first. And usually it's that talk that spurs the discussion that follows. And so your speakers are your first sharers. So treat them with some reverence, or treat the talks with some reverence. Encourage your speakers not to see it as a moment for self-glory, but for servant leadership. Encourage them to, treat your talks with priority. So try not to make them, So we want to make sure that we're grateful to our speakers. Putting yourself out there first can be a really challenging thing to do. And so we want to make sure that our speakers feel supported encouraged, and that when they've given their talk, we show our full gratitude so that they know that what they've done is so important to us and to the retreat, and that it's really done a lot to move us forward on the experience together. So witness talks. Second area that I think is really, really worthy of the deep, fuller attention is faith sharing. The thing I always like to say is that it's a crucial opportunity in teenage life where you can get teenagers to distinguish a particular type of conversation or discussion. So it's not hallway or cafeteria chatter. It's not the type of discussion they'd have in a classroom. It's close to some of the prayer experiences they've had, but still even distinct from that. So it really helps if you can give faith sharing some good time on retreat. Have frequent discussions, at least as part of each unit or movement of the retreat. If you have a shorter retreat that's just a few hours or a school day, even to just include a few 10 or 15-minute periods of discussion, helps students kind of practice using those muscles and seeing what a conversation is like, and will prepare them to have better discussions in their more intensive retreats later on. It's good to give each faith sharing period to a discussion, to give a small group their own breakout room. Ideally, at a retreat center, that means giving them a room with a closed door and a window where you can come and peek in and make sure everything's okay, or give them time warnings. If you are stuck in like a large multi-purpose room or a large meeting room and groups are just given tables, do your best to maximize the distance between groups so that there's minimal eavesdropping and that groups have minimal chance to distract each other. But again, ideally, if you can get them into their own rooms, all the better for confidentiality and trust as well. There definitely needs to be context. The trust and confidentiality in a small group is huge. So make sure your small group leaders start the first conversation with a really clear guarantee that everyone in the group is going to commit to keeping what's shared in that discussion amongst the members of that group. And to challenge them a little bit that what you put into the small group is what you get out of it. So if your choice is to sit silently and not pay attention, it's unlikely to yield much for you in your spiritual growth. But if you put yourself out there a little bit and share, and you also listen attentively, the resonance that you'll find with peers can be really rich and impactful. One of the things that helps faith sharing go really well is when you have prepared, trained, and supported student leaders. A big part of that in your student leadership formation time, challenge them to be retrospective. How did your retreats go? How did your discussions go? What were your small group leaders like? Identify some strengths and weaknesses, and then turn it and challenge them to look at themselves. Are you excited, worried, nervous to be a facilitator? What do you think you bring to the table? What would you like to work on? Start it with their own experience and their own self-perceptions. From there, definitely do some practical training. Some groups have the maturity to handle like a role play type situation where maybe you assign different roles, like only speaking in a few words, oversharing with long stories. Maybe another person is pretending to try to take over the group. For students that maybe aren't prepared to do kind of role playing type stuff, you could have them do a dry run. So extract a few questions from a discussion that'll come up on retreat and do a mini version of that as sort of a practice in your formation meetings. Additionally, I like to try to encourage them on some soft skills. So how to react to students, the types of character traits that you want to see in leaders who are being effective for their small group members. So few things you could hit on. Avoid cliches. Try not to say things like everything happens for a reason or I know exactly how you feel. Try to practice empathy. Identify the emotions that are behind other people's story sharing and affirm them without presuming that you know what's going on in their lives. Show them respect. Don't offer them advice or try to fix them. Make space for them to share, listen and hear them out, and then ask follow-up questions that challenge them to look into themselves further and think about a way going forward. And finally, gratitude. I always tell them, if you don't know what to say thank you. Be a grateful and appreciative leader. Demonstrate that to your students as they participate over and over again. The one thing I do tell them is don't become a thanks for sharing robot. Try to vary what you say and personalize your appreciation as you respond to each student. Finally, the middle school students and high school students, they need structure, but every group is going to be different. So you need to offer that structure, but you shouldn't require something absolutely particular. The one thing I will say is that every student leader needs to have a discussion guide handy with some recommended questions. It helps to make sure that the discussion is going to be relevant. It makes sure that every small group is sort of talking about the same thing generally and heading in the same direction. And it also makes sure that your leaders are going to attempt to make that faith sharing pivot. So this isn't just a chat or a discussion about something where we make kind of general opinionated statements, but rather it's an opportunity for us to look to spirituality and to our faith and to try to ask ourselves, how do we see God? How do we struggle to see God? Am I aware of God's love and the Holy Spirit's movement in my life? Is it something I struggle to see? And the way that I always say that leaders should try to do this is, I don't want you to close your binder and set it aside, but I also don't want you to open it and hold it in front of your face. I think you should have it open and handy, and you should refer to it as a guide, but not a script. And hopefully your leaders will kind of gain an organic appreciation for how that works. Every group's going to have a different way of pursuing that. Some are going to need that really heavy structure. Maybe the leader asks the questions, everyone journals a few minutes, then we go in a circle and take turns. Other groups might need no structure at all. A loose, open-ended question kind of gets the ball rolling, and then the facilitator can take it from there. Most groups are going to fall in between and vary between what they need. So it's kind of up to a student to get those instincts and learn how to help a group to have its most effective discussion. The metaphor that I like to use is that the best student leader facilitators are like traffic cops. So if you imagine a policeman standing in an intersection, you're basically just making sure that traffic flows in one direction and doesn't go in the other. And then you change the direction as it warrants so that turns are taken in an equitable way. That's what I think the best faith sharing looks like. So with respect to witness talks and with respect to faith sharing, what it all kind of comes down to is student leadership. And the really important thing is that you have really strong student leadership and really intentional formation for those student leaders. So first of all, there's got to be quality and quantity of opportunity. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a temptation to really try to match certain roles to certain prospective students. But I find that you're always better off when your leadership opportunities are well known, well advertised, when many people are invited to consider them, and when you can get a really wide pool of applicants to consider. I think basically every retreat could have a student leadership component, maybe with the exception of seniors who perhaps would benefit from adults or alumni taking a role so that they don't have to lead one another, although peer leadership opportunities work for seniors too. But I think it's always valuable for students to have peer leadership on these retreat experiences. When you're getting students to apply for leadership on a simple retreat, it might be something as simple as just a few responses to some short answers, just to kind of be a screener for a simpler leadership role. When you get into more intensive retreats, you should definitely have an application process that includes writing some thoughtful responses to application questions. Ideally, you have students come in and sit for oral interviews with at least the campus minister or retreat director, preferably 2 or 3 adults who can variously ask questions and see how the student responds. But it also should involve a really good vetting process. Talk with other teachers, talk with staff across the building, talk with coaches and club moderators to get a different spin on how the student works in different environments. And then I always find it really valuable to talk to counselors and to ask if the student is prepared to take on a really serious leadership opportunity. Kind of built into that, it helps you build a balanced team instead of just getting a team of the highest achieving students or the smartest students. When you talk to all of those people, you can put together a really good portrait of a student, looping in their interview and application too. You can build a balanced team, extroverts and introverts, kids in sports, kids in clubs, kids who are really polished writers, kids who are really good with soft skills and social skills, and you can create a balanced team, and that's how you're gonna have the best retreat you can have. When it comes to training those students, it really helps to have a formation plan. As best you can, try not to wing it. Try not to wait until right before you need to start training them to decide how you're going to do it. Put a plan in place, implement it with the leadership team, keep notes for yourself, and then tweak and improve it for the next time. Identify some integral elements and build around those as you need to prepare those leaders. How can you teach them to practice leading and sharing prayer, to be small group discussion facilitators, to construct and hone your small groups with you and maybe even make slight edits to your schedule? How can you teach them to write and share stories and then discern talks? How can you help them write a good talk and deliver a good talk? And then how can they be of assistance for logistical concerns like packing, planning, and other things leading up to the retreat? I have a temptation during student leadership to be really focused on the practical training part, like preparing them to give good talks and be good discussion facilitators, that I sometimes will overlook forming them in prayer. So I always try to make myself get a student to volunteer to lead the next meeting in prayer and to have them do that the next time. and then to finish a meeting with some sort of brief faith sharing or check-in, even something as simple as how are you feeling right now with X weeks until the retreat, or what are you most excited for, are you most nervous about, and to make sure there's an avenue for them to be like prayerfully and spiritually aware and not just become preparation robots in that regard. Finally, something I always encourage, maximize your student responsibility. As much as you can, try to give your student leaders a long leash and an opportunity to take charge of things. And then you can always pull it back or restrain things a little bit more as you need to. You should always stay in charge of things like assigning bedrooms, paying the bills, purchasing the supplies, but then think in a different way. What can students do? What can they take off your plate? What can they be in charge of and be more directing? So definitely things like small group facilitation, preparing and delivering talks, but could they moderate a large group activity or discussion? Could they take on a retreat direction role or MC parts or all of the retreat? Could they become part of a team that plans, creates, and directs a retreat from scratch or redesigns an existing retreat in a new way? I think as much as possible, giving them a chance and then supporting them closely is when you'll really see the most significant and sometimes even the most surprising growth in your student leaders. And I just think if campus ministers commit to that, then they'll see really, really good results. So just as kind of a wrap up point, I work for the Clerics of St. Viator, the Viatorians, a men's religious community of brothers and priests and lay associates. And our founder, Father Curbs, one of his famous quotes is that we're bolder when we dream we're doing God's work. So I want to challenge you, embrace this opportunity as best you can. We're definitely all worn out and stressed, and there's definitely ways that the pandemic has totally changed the way we may approach retreat ministry. But this is also an opportunity for what comes next. If we can use something like this self-audit process, we can identify the ideals and values that we want to be pursuing, and we can get ourselves closer to there and give our students really, really high quality retreat experiences in the ways that we hope we can. So with that said, just a couple notes. The QR code is still there if you want to go back to my link tree and grab that resource packet. I want to encourage you to consider the Facebook group, NFCYM Network for High School Campus Ministers and Religion Teachers. I know many NCEA attendees are already in there commenting and asking questions regularly. They're always welcome to reach out to me on Twitter or by email, and my contact information is there. If you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat now, and our NCEA team will pass them along to me. I already have a couple in here, so I'm going to use the remaining time to address these a little bit. So one person asked, what are best practices or resources for middle school retreats? Personally, I've only worked with middle schoolers a little bit. A couple things I found, they work much better in shorter movements and units. So whereas high schoolers maybe can sit and listen to a 15 to 30 minute talk, have a little journaling time and move to a 45 or 60-minute discussion, middle schoolers benefit a lot more from much more differentiation, punchier, shorter segments, and varying your mode a lot more. So if you have something that maybe on a high school retreat would be a 30-minute adult talk, maybe for middle schoolers, it's a 5 or 10-minute talk, a 5 or 10-minute interactive discussion, and then a 5 or 10-minute like kinetic or tactile activity that requires them to move or interact in a different way. I think the longer you have 11 to 14-year-olds sitting in Indian style on the carpeted room of your school library or something, the harder it's going to be to really get anywhere with them. So varying the mode with differentiation and shorter periods, I think, is a better way to achieve objectives that you're trying to get. I also will say that I'm better suited to high school students, and I did not stick with my middle schoolers as well as some of my peers did. And I think that there's just people who are better suited to the pedagogy of working with middle schoolers. So it's good to acknowledge that in ourselves too. Another question, what are some best practices or resources for Catholic higher ed institution retreats? That's a great question. My experience is primarily in high school, a little bit with middle school students. Having worked a little bit with adult faith formation, I can say that adults are better suited to some of the individualized stuff that maybe fits in around professional lives, or for a college student, maybe fits in better around a class schedule. So I know some of my peers in higher ed institutions have had a success with things like encouraging spiritual direction, building like a resource of local spiritual directors that you could refer students to. Also success with things like busy persons retreats, where there's kind of a central activity set, or maybe like a half-hour meeting each day through a week, but then there's individual check-ins over Zoom or video chat or phone calls with spiritual directors who may or may not even be on site. I also know that college campuses are a great place for adoration. So if you have a priest or a trained server who can set up a Eucharistic adoration chapel, it's a really healthy thing to have an open schedule. And I know at my university, we were invited to sign up for a slot that was our standing slot every week. So you had a time every week where you could come in and pray before the Blessed Sacrament. As far as practices and resources, one of my favorite places to turn is the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. They're the ones who lead Notre Dame Vision for high school students, but they also have a program for campus and youth ministers. And they're also a group in flux during the pandemic. But the McGrath Institute for Church Life does a lot of resourcing for professional and pastoral ministers across the church. And their resources are informed by some of the best academic background and some of the best pastoral practice you can find out there. Do you have any, so this last question here, do you have any resources or recommendations for elementary sacramental retreats, First Communion especially? I will be honest, I do not. I have no experience with students younger than middle school, and I apologize that I can't provide anything directly for that. I will say that just having popped in a little bit to the NCAA live feed and to the NCAA Expo, virtual Expo, there's a ton of vendors here gathered for NCAA who do have some great stuff, and I'm sure they'd love to see you in their virtual booths or receive a message from you. And they could offer some things that could be more relevant to you and to that age group in First Communion especially. Any upcoming retreats for retreat directors? That's a great question. I'm not sure. I know that some of the programs I'm familiar with are sort of in a holding pattern, trying to figure out what will be available and doable this summer as the vaccine rollout continues and people hopefully are getting us up towards herd immunity. But I'm not sure about that either. I'm happy to stay in touch if anybody would like some referrals for any of these things or wants to connect about me helping you out with something along those lines. I'd be happy to talk more. The one thing that I will point you to for your own programs is the QR code there will bring you to my Linktree site. And the top link is a resource packet with all of the values I discussed in the PowerPoint today. Each section has a little bit about why that value or ideal is important, a couple suggestions for how you could further the practice of that ideal in your retreats, and then a few questions for self-auditing your retreat program that maybe you and some staff or colleagues could sit with and ask yourselves about as you think about your retreats, with an eye towards trying to develop them further, move them forward as things move back into hopefully a more normal way of what we're accustomed to. So definitely check out that packet on the Linktree. I'm also going to pop onto the NCAA live feed after this and find a way to share my slides if that's more helpful for you. So that'll pop up in your live feeds after this. And then I know that live sessions are getting moved into the on-demand library after they've gone off. So you're welcome to check this out or refer colleagues or friends to it when it gets posted there for future access as well. With that, if there's no other questions, I think I'll let my NCAA teammates take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Thank you guys for attending this live session at NCEA 2021. Please make sure to complete the post-session evaluation and use this opportunity to check out our other live and on-demand sessions, our learning lounges, and our virtual exhibit hall, and so much more. We'll see you soon.